In 1991, 6 teenagers sat down to play a role-playing game. They disappeared without explanation and without clues. They had vanished. They were found 2 years later in a forest over 50 miles away. When asked where they'd been, they couldn't respond. No one ever found out where they had gone or who could have taken them. Everyone was just glad they had escaped. Decades later, the teenagers, now adults, discovered no one escapes. Now we're about to play that very same RPG. Welcome to Die. So, Goth Jumanji? Is this based off the old D&D cartoon? I thought this was a comic book. Oh, Die. 'Cause it's the singular of dice, but also we're gonna? Alright, time for some Eldritch history. The Die comic ran for 20 issues from 2018 to 2021. It was written and created by Kieran Gillen. He's also written The Wicked and the Divine, Phonogram, and basically every Marvel character. Stephanie Hans did the art for the series. She also worked with Kieran on The Wicked and the Divine, also worked on Journey into Mystery and Batwoman. The letterer was Clayton Coles. He's worked on everything, Batman, Daredevil, X-Men. He's Eisner Award nominated. Also working on the book were Ryan Hughes, who's the designer, Chrissy Williams, editor. It was published by Image Comics. For those of you unfamiliar with the comic, I'll give you the basic plot setup. In the early 90s, a group of 6 teenagers are brought together to play an RPG that one of them has designed. This game master also hands out these strange polyhedral dice, one to each of the players. When they start playing, they're sucked into this fantasy world. And then 2 years later, 5 of them reemerge without the game master, and they're unable to even talk about what had happened during that time. Decades pass, and they're eventually reunited after they receive the missing D20 that the game master, their missing friend, had. They receive that, gather back together, and then get sucked back into this fantasy world. That's issue 1, and the rest just get more wild from there. But I don't want to really spoil the comic here because I think you should go out and read it. At least issue 1, you can find that for free on the website, and I'll have a link in the show notes. So if I'm not going to talk about what happened in the comic, you might be wondering, what am I going to talk about? Well, 2 things. 1, Mr. Gillen did his homework, or at least is so entrenched within RPGs that the book is infused with all kinds of nods and references and homages to role-playing games and their predecessors and their history. And 2, while doing all that research and making a comic book, he also is designing an actual RPG. The beta has been out for years, and currently they're making it into a fully fledged release that should be out at the end of 2022. So that's the future for Die, and we'll talk more about the RPG in the back half of this episode, but I like to start off at the beginning. So Kieran Gillen describes the origins of Die as he and his friends were talking about whatever happened to the D&D cartoon kids. So for you unfamiliar, from 1983 to 1985, Dungeons & Dragons had a Saturday morning cartoon. The plot revolved around a group of kids getting on a roller coaster, a Dungeons & Dragons roller coaster, that transported them to the realm of Dungeons & Dragons. And they're all given magical weapons by the Dungeon Master. They had to fight against a bunch of different D&D creatures, but mainly against Venger, who is this evil wizard, kind of looked like a devil demon guy. He had giant bat wings and one horn on his head. And throughout most of the episodes, they're just looking for a way to get back home. Unfortunately, the series was canceled before they ever did, which is what led Kieran and his friends to talk about whatever happened to them. But the 80s cartoon was certainly not the only inspiration or influence on the comic. Just looking at the titles of the issues and the collected editions, you can see a wealth of references to RPGs, video games, and comics. They range from the pretty familiar to most people, the party, players, dungeons, the inn, to getting more specific with things like dual wield, wisdom check, total party kill, split the party. Some games are name checked, such as Risk or Little Wars. More on Little Wars later. And other terminology is also thrown in, such as grind, as in grinding for levels or treasure in RPGs. Legacy heroes, as in comic characters who pass the mantle on to either their children or somebody else. A self-insert, a literary device where the author actually puts themselves in their work. Or hidden role, which is common in social deduction games where you have to figure out a traitor or a specific player who is not who they appear to be. Some I thought I knew, but surprised me a little bit when I looked them up. One of those was THAC0, which references the second edition 2-hit AC0, which was how you calculated if you would hit a creature. They also appear in 5th edition. In Wild Beyond the Witchlight, there is THAC0 the Clown, who is an angry old man who hates children. A little jab at the old editions. But for those of you who didn't play, here's the easiest summation of THAC0 I can come up with. So AC, armor class, would range from 10 to -10. 10 being the worst, -10 being the best. THAC0 would start at 20 and go down as you leveled up. And to determine if you would hit, you would take your THAC0 number, subtract your opponent's AC, and that would be the number you'd have to roll above in order to hit them. I see a lot of hate for this system online. I don't think it's terribly difficult once you know how it goes. It just seems very unintuitive for me to be subtracting things and going down in numbers. I don't know why they went with that. I greatly prefer the current bonus to hit and just go against the armor class. The other one that surprised me was boss fight. Of course, I know this from video game terminology. I'm sure most of you know exactly what I mean when I say boss fight. The big bad guy at the end of a level or whatever that you have to fight. This was potentially actually derived from D&D, as the first video game to actually feature a boss was called D&D, and it was designed by Gary Wisenhunt, Ray Wood, and later Dirk Pellet. And the first boss in the game, the first boss in any game, was a gold dragon that guarded the orb, one of these two artifacts that you had to find in the game to succeed. And the rest are terms that I don't think the average player would be familiar with. They're things that you wouldn't really get just by playing games. Some of them, the ones to do with safety tools, you might if you play with anybody who plays with them. But the other ones are things that you'd have to actually look into games in order to know about. So I'm going to spend some time explaining all of these. The first one is Fantasy Heartbreaker. This is a term that Ron Edwards coined on the Forge website. He was describing 90s indie RPGs that were just a step away from their fantasy RPG influence, mostly D&D. He calls them heartbreakers because he can see the love and care and time that went into the creation of these. But they're so close to the old role-playing games. They're so close to just being D&D with house rules baked in that any innovations they say that they have are essentially just 20 years too late to be anything really that innovative. And he often puts the term fantasy in quotes because they're derived from very specific old school D&D and RPG fantasy tropes that have baked in assumptions that these old games have. They'd have the same weapon or armor classifications as these old games, sometimes just lifting the list straight up of old editions of D&D. So they're not breaking any new ground in the fantasy department, nor in the rules. A lot of people claim that this term fantasy heartbreaker is derogatory and it's like kind of dismissal. But Ron Edwards doesn't say that. And in the article, he even recommends a few of these fantasy heartbreakers. And he says, he ends it with, "Come get your heart broken with me." The next title I want to explain is Premise Rejection. And the author Kieran Gillen actually describes this, I think, very succinctly on his own in one of the essays found at the end of the books. He says, the title is a nod to Robin D. Laws's phrase, used to describe when a group of players explicitly reject the concept of the game. The players don't want to take the ring to Mordor. The players want to bum around Hobbiton and hit on Rosie. This is closely linked to another concept, namely a failure to get buy-in. Buy-in signals to a group the game we're going to be playing and asks them to enter a social contract to do that. If you're playing a game of heroic adventure, you play Heroic Adventurers. If you don't want to be a Heroic Adventurer, we can play a different game. This title fittingly comes in an issue when the players don't go along with the game master's plans for how the game should go. Then we have two titles that have to do with RPG safety tools. And safety tools are things that groups can put in place to allow them to talk about issues and themes that might cause players to become stressed or anxious or worried, and do so with rules and expectations in place to make sure that it remains a game that you're playing. Some groups will establish safety tools and never need them, and other groups will not use them, and they really should have. If you haven't played with safety tools, I highly encourage you to look them up. I'll have links in the show notes where you can find out about them. But the two referenced are X-Card, which is what it sounds like. It's a card with an X on it, and it's developed by John Stavropoulos. And basically, any player at any time can just tap on the X card, and that'll stop whatever is happening in the game. It's just like, nope, I don't want this in the game. I don't want to deal with it. It's anything that can make that player uncomfortable, and no explanation is needed. They just, okay, that either didn't happen, or we're just completely going to the next thing. We're not going to talk about this anymore. And the other set of safety tools referenced is Lines and Veils. For this, we're going back to Ron Edwards, the fantasy heartbreaker. He developed this and wrote about it in his Sex and Sorcery supplement for the RPG Sorcerer. And Lines and Veils are generally set up before a game even begins, like before any session, before the campaign starts. Lines are elements or themes that are not to be crossed. They're just, we're not going to have this in our game. It doesn't exist. We don't talk about it. Not here. Veils, on the other hand, are things that could technically happen, but we're not going to focus on it. The most common comparison I see is like sex on TV. We'll show you enough that you know what's happening, but we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty. It's going to happen off camera. We're not going to see it. So it's not going to directly happen in our game, even if it does happen in our world. The title of the last collected edition also gets into care around RPGs and how it can actually affect the people playing them. And it's called Bleed. And Bleed was coined by Emily Cairboss of Black and Green Games. And she used the term bleed to refer to emotional spillover from player to character, which would be bleed in, or from character to player, bleed out. It's very commonly associated with the Nordic LARP scene, especially Jeep Form, which is played very close to home, kind of experimental. They want you to experience things as your character does, or they want to draw out emotions from the players to impact their characters. It's also referenced that in LARPing, bleed happens a lot with romantic entanglements. Like if you care about somebody, you might have your character in game care about them or show them some affection. Or if you're married in a game, it might drive you to actually like that person or something like that. Or it could be as simple as you had just a stressful day, and then you sit down at the table and then you're playing your character as just a jerk. And the last term from the titles that I want to get into is from the last issue number 20. That's Open Table. So what this is describing is instead of having a dedicated game group, like here's my 6 players, we meet every Friday at 8 p.m. and play. An open table is what it sounds like. It's open for anybody. You can be like, oh, I suddenly have a Tuesday free, so text everybody who likes to play, and you're like, hey, you want to play? And then whoever shows up, you run a game with them. Both the original creators of D&D, Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax, reference having an open table when they were playing their home games in Blackmoor and Greyhawk, respectively. And it was said that they had 50 players or more in their campaigns, and they had an open table, so whoever would show up, and they'd play, which sounds amazing. There is another element that was lifted from the cartoon. That's the land having a master overlooking it. In the cartoon, there was the dungeon master who had mysterious powers and had quite a bit of control over things, but wasn't fully able to do anything. Similar, the World and Die, which is an icosahedron, 20-sided, like a D20. That's its shape. And each face is a different realm, a different land. And it's unclear if the Masters has fully control over the entirety of the face or just sections within it. There's at least one that definitely has multiple Masters. And Kieran lifted these Masters from real people who left an indelible mark on the history and the shaping of role-playing games. I won't be spoiling their purpose in the plot, but I will be essentially spoiling the cameos from the Die comic, so you've been warned. And I'll be running through these in a chronological order, so they won't be necessarily the order that they appear in the comic. And the first ones I want to talk about actually didn't even appear in the comic. They are just referenced. But it's the father and son von Reitwitzes. They are regarded as the grandfather and father of modern wargaming. Now, before them, there were other war games, especially in Prussia and Germany. And these precursors were based on chess. The pieces would represent real military units, and everything was locked into a grid like a chessboard. Each of the squares would be color-coded to represent different terrains, hills, rivers, stuff like that. There was a couple of critiques with these style of war games. Mainly, they weren't realistic enough. The pieces and terrain were constrained to chess grid movement, so it's very right angles and straight lines, which isn't really how nature and terrain work, nor how units really moved around the battlefield. Only one piece could occupy a square at a time, regardless of how big a unit it was supposed to represent or how big an area the square was supposed to represent. So even if it was a whole square mile and you just had a small infantry troop, it would take up the whole thing and no one else could be there. And then even if a piece represented a group of a bunch of soldiers, it was removed like a chess piece when attacked, so you'd just lose the whole thing. There was no hit points or anything like that. Then George Leopold von Reiswitz, a Prussian nobleman and wargamer, he sought to fix these criticisms and create a more realistic game with more free-form movement over a more natural terrain. So he designed a table where he basically just had layers of wet sand, and he shaped those into the hills and valleys. And then he used wooden blocks for troop formation. And being a nobleman, he eventually attracted the attention of the Prussian princes. They heard about it, asked for a demonstration, and they liked it so much, they recommended it to their father, King Wilhelm III. Not wanting to present a table of wet sand to the king, von Reitwitz designed a more elaborate setup. And in 1812, he presented a wooden table cabinet. All the components were stored in the drawers. There was a folding board that was placed on top to serve as a 6-foot by 6-foot playing surface. The battlefield was made up of porcelain tiles that depicted modular terrain features in painted bas relief. The troop formations were also porcelain blocks. And the royal family loved it and frequently played it. But it never really reached a larger audience for several reasons. One, the apparatus was too expensive for mass production. It's a table cabinet. It's huge. And then Reiswitz was also reportedly too distracted by the Napoleonic Wars at the time to perfect the game, and elements such as resolving the effects of gunfire and hand-to-hand combat weren't really fully worked out. And then finally, by 1816, just 4 years after presenting the table, George seems to have lost interest in wargaming altogether. Luckily, enter in his son, George Heinrich Rudolf Johann von Reiswitz. And he was a junior officer in the Prussian army. And he took the reign, along with the help of a circle of junior officers in Berlin. They continued to develop the game. And their developments really took the game, called Kriegspiel, literally German for war game, and took it to the next level. In their version, units could suffer partial losses, yet still remain in play, hit points, essentially. And they modeled variable damage by determining casualties through dice rolls. So you'd roll for damage. It also used large-scale topographical maps, which were the product of new advances in cartography and printing, and it allowed for more natural terrain and real locations. And probably the biggest change that they made was they introduced an umpire. So the players would write down their orders for their troops. The umpire would take those and move them as he thought the troops would interpret the orders. The umpire was also the one who rolled the dice in combat, computed the effects, and removed slain units. Having the umpire also allowed for the fog of war. They could only place the units that could be seen by both sides, just keeping track and remaining them basically invisible. And having the umpire also allowed for the filling in of any gaps in the rules. They could use their judgment in order to make decisions. This resulted in umpires who had to be very familiar with the rules and actually fairly competent military strategists as well in order to properly interpret and make decisions as the troops would. In 1824, one of the Prussian princes had joined Reiswitz's gaming circle by them, and he once again invited him to present to the king and his senior generals. Again, they loved it, and the king ordered that every regiment receive a set. But 2 years later, 1826, Reitswitz is transferred. And this is mainly seen as a banishment, and it's supposedly due to rumored offensive remarks about his superiors. Later, a friend and fellow officer would write that there were jealous people in the Prussian court who basically sabotaged Reitswitz and misreported his remarks. Regardless of which of those stories is true, Reitswitz fell into a depression and he shot himself a year later. And then a year after that, his father died as well. And their game understandably would suffer at the loss of both its makers. But a dedicated following would continue to refine and expand upon the game, and there's still Kriegspiel gaming groups to this day. Going from the gaming aspect of RPGs to the role-playing aspect, the next cameo I want to mention are the Bronte siblings, Branwell, Charlotte, Anne, and Emily. Perhaps best known for the writings of the sisters, Charlotte wrote Jane Eyre, Anne wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is referenced as one of the first feminist novels, and Emily wrote Wuthering Heights. You may be wondering what this has to do with role-playing games, but we'll get there, I promise. So in 1826, Branwell is given 12 wooden soldiers by his father, and these spark everything, basically. They each take one or several and make their own avatar out of it. Charlotte has the idea that each of them will have their own island in this world that they make up. They'll call the Glasstown Confederacy, because the capital of each island will be a city called Glasstown. And the kids go wild with this idea. They write dozens of magazines, books, plays, poetry, all set in this world, which Charlotte and Branwell will eventually split off and make a world called Angria, while Anne and Emily make their world of Gondal, all based around the stories that they made with these wooden soldiers who they described as adventurers who sought out and established this Glasstown Confederacy off the coast of Africa. These writings are sometimes described as very early forms of speculative fiction, of science fiction, of fan fiction, because some of the soldiers were representative of actual soldiers from history, and they'd each write about each other's characters as well. And it's also described as some early formalized role-playing. The kids seem to inhabit these characters in these worlds. We mostly know about it through the letters that they wrote to each other, in which they described the things that happened in this fantasy world as the same way they would describe anything that actually happened in the real world lives. And the stories they talk about are elaborate depictions of war and romance and betrayal and revenge, on par with anything from Tolkien or George R.R. Martin. By the end of 1839, Charlotte Bronte was so fixated with this world that she felt she had to sever ties from it. She was finding that more and more she preferred to escape to her imagined worlds over remaining in reality. She feared that she was going to go mad. So she even wrote Farewell to Angria, where she says goodbye to her characters, scenes, and subjects, and she writes with such pain that it's like she's tearing herself away from friends. From the Brontes, we move on to another literary figure, this time H.G. Wells. He shows up because he wrote a couple of gaming books. The most relevant to this story is Little Wars. The full title being Little Wars, a game for boys from 12 years of age to 150, and for that more intelligent sort of girl who likes boys' games and books. Lovely little needless, sexless remark in that title, which is actually called out in the Die comic, which is kind of great. Wells is most known for writing books like The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, War of the Worlds. So he wrote this book, Little Wars. It's all about the rules of how to play with these toy artillery guns and tin soldiers. So his story goes that a friend was over and they had some of these soldiers and one of this little gun. It's like this little 4-inch gun that would fire out a little wooden peg. And his friend, a fellow author, was taking shots at these tin soldiers from across the room. Like they made a little game out of it. And then Wells decided to develop into a full game. So he wrote about laying down encyclopedias on the ground and setting up these troops and stuff. And they'd play. And eventually he wrote this book, Little Wars, about the rules of how to move the units, when and how you could fire, and stuff like that. It's worth noting that this book became pretty popular, and there's a great little video of Peter Cushing, the actor who played Grand Moff Tarkin in Star Wars, and Dr. Frankenstein and Dracula for a bunch of Hammer horror films. And there's a video online you can find. I'll put a link. And it's him painting his soldiers for playing Little Wars with, which is pretty cool. And the base rules are fairly simplistic, but he also included some appendices with expanded rules that would cover things like military logistics, engineers and cavalry charges, and railway transport of troops. And I think some of the best parts about it are the pictures and illustrations of Wells and his friends, these full-grown men in suits down on the ground or outside in the grass, like playing with these little toy soldiers and cannons. It's pretty great. So these cameos represent the things that are necessary for D&D to exist. You need the war game. You need the game in order to have something to play. You need these rules about how you can roll to attack and hit things. But without the role play embodied by the Brontes, you don't have an RPG. You still just have a war game. So you need both elements to come together to really have these games where you embodied a character going through a game like D&D in order to tell stories with your friends. And that's why Kieran Gillen included these characters, these people, into the work, because they were so important for the game and the hobby to develop the way that it did. But he's not done. There's a few more cameos that I want to point out as well. The next one is H.P. Lovecraft shows up. And, mainly revolves around his Call of Cthulhu story and the Cthulhu mythos at large, which of course became a game by Chaosium in 1981, Call of Cthulhu. But the short story was inspired by one of Lovecraft's actual dreams. In a letter to a friend, he's quoted very similar to in the story, but he said in his dream, he asked, "Why do you say that this thing is new? The dreams of men are older than brooding Egypt or the contemplative Sphinx or garden-girdled Babylon, and this was fashioned in my dreams." I'll definitely do an episode about Lovecraft and gaming and Cthulhu. But there's a couple of things I want to point out for this episode. With Call of Cthulhu, it kind of had a different operational guideline than a lot of RPGs did up until that point. Instead of being the heroes that it's expected that you will prevail, survive, Call of Cthulhu games, you're normally just regular people that fall into these situations that are beyond the imaginings of men, because that's the kind of thing Lovecraft liked to write about. It's really not guaranteed that you're survive. It's kind of gotten a reputation as being a game system where more than likely, if you ever actually encounter anything of the supernatural, you're probably not going to make it out alive. I think the aspects of being normal people drawn into this wild world, or survival not really being expected or guaranteed, and encountering these things that are just so beyond the normal realm of reality, so outside it, you can feel that, especially later on in the work of Dye in the comic. You can feel those influences pretty strongly, I feel. And then the last cameo I want to talk about, which is actually the first one you see in the comic, is J.R.R. Tolkien shows up. And I appreciate this from Gillen because although The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings do show up in Appendix N, the references of things that influence the game of Dungeons & Dragons, I feel like Gary Gygax kind of undersold the impact it had on the game. Now, I believe that he personally wasn't as inspired by Tolkien's work as he was by some of the more pulp fantasy, but I feel like Tolkien kind of got undersold on how big an impact he had in the game. I mean, the Ranger class is Strider from Lord of the Rings. Halflings are hobbits. They used to be called that. So there's a lot of elements from those stories that made it into the game. And then also some of the earlier versions of the games that they played, the precursors to D&D, when they had just the fantasy supplement for the war game of Chainmail, a lot of the battles they were recreating were ones from Lord of the Rings. It's like, even if it wasn't Gygax's entry point in the fantasy, it has been for so many people for so long that having this call out as one of the first cameos in this book as an influence on the kids who are playing in the comic and so many other role players, I think is a welcome shout out. And by no means is Tolkien, an ignored figure or anything like that. He gets plenty of credit, but I do appreciate it in the origins of role playing games, pointing out, yeah, he's a big influence on why people play these games. So I think that's cool. Okay, so on to Dye the RPG. Now, Kieran Gillen and Stephanie Hans are developing this with Rowan Rook and Deckard. And this is a British game publisher that's known for Heart, Spire, and Honey Heist. The description of the game goes like this. In Die, you play a group of authentically flawed people from the real world who gather together to play an RPG and are dragged into a fantasy realm. They then have to find their way home, or not. Much like in the comic, the world of the Die RPG is based around the players. So instead of drawing in your own emotions and baggage, when you start playing the Die RPG, you create a persona. It's the real world person, quote unquote. They have hopes, fears, dreams, and failings, and all these are used to create the fantasy world. So parents, bullies, and ex-lovers are all fair game to become villains in the story. So your persona is the one who makes the character and are drawn into the game and embodies that character in the world of Die. And the character classes in Die are amazing. So there's 6 classes, and each one is granted exclusive use of their die type and is intrinsically linked with that type of die. The design even was influenced by the associations with those dice. I'll get into them and you'll see what I mean. First up are the Masters, holders of the D20 and played by the GM. These are reality-warping, metatextual wizards who exert their control over space and time through the medium of dangerous magic or, if that fails, cheating. This is the DM, mage, and wizard all rolled into one. They hold the D20 because that's what the world is. The world of Die is an icosahedron, and the Masters can warp that reality. They have control in that world. Just like the DM has control over their campaigns, just like wizards can warp reality in order to make magical effects happen. Next up are the Godbinders, who are clerics who bargain with their pantheon of gods to get miracles at the best possible rate. These are the cleric as a demonologist, and they hold under the D12. The D12 is the second largest die, just under the D20, and this represents that the god's power is directly below the power of the master. D20s and D12s, we're going to get into some geometry stuff right here. D20s and D12s are dual polyhedra, so they're opposites, where one has points, the other one has faces. Gillen describes this as the D20 represents the natural, and since it's the opposite, the D12 must be the supernatural. 12 is also very common in religions. There were 12 Olympians, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles, 12 petals in Anahata, the heart chakra, and Odin had 12 sons. The D10 represents the Neos, techno-magical rogues stealing elusive fair gold to power their cybernetic gifts. These are obviously rogue thieves. They're called Neos because it's as in new. The D10 isn't a platonic solid like the rest of the dice are for RPGs. A platonic solid is a 3D shape that meets 2 criteria. 1, each face is a regular polygon. And a regular polygon is one where all the sides and angles are equal. And 2, they have the same number of faces meeting at each corner. So take the tetrahedron, the D4, for example. All the sides are equilateral triangles, and each corner has 3 faces meeting at it. There's only 5 of these platonic solids, and they've been known from back in antiquity. Ancient Egyptians and Romans had D20s that they would make. But the D10 that we know today wasn't common until the 80s. Before that, they would use a D20 with 0 through 9 or 1 through 10 on it twice, which is why original D20s had to be half shaded with crayons. I think I'll have an episode going into the history of dice in the future because it's surprisingly fascinating. Going back to the Neo and the D10, 10 is 1 and 0, aka binary, or the 2 sides to a coin. And when developing this, Gillen wanted a reversal of the 90s cyberpunk, especially Shadowrun, where instead of adding magic to cyberpunk, he wanted to bring cyberpunk to a fantasy land. And it became natural for it to be the thief because they needed this treasure like no one else does. They are driven by this fair gold that they get from their enemies. And the fair are described as elves as designed by William Gibson, which William Gibson is basically the father of cyberpunk. His most notable work being Neuromancer. The D8 represents the Emotion Knights, warriors who feed one sacred emotion into their arcane sentient weapons to devastating effect. You can't have a work based on D&D without a fighter. You need a fighter, but they're boring. Just hit things with their swords most of the time. The D8 was perfect for this fighter class because it's the standard longsword damage, so that alone could have made it go that way. And Kieran debated going with Barbarian, but then focused in on Paladin. And in old school games, Paladins needed to be lawful good. But he always thought that if religions varied to all the alignments, why aren't there Paladins for all the alignments as well? There should be one for every religion, after all. And that worked out too, because barring True Neutral, if you look, there's 8 other alignments branching off from there. So it works with the D8 as well. The only issue is that Kieran says, quote, alignment is rubbish. He didn't want to have alignment in his comic. Luckily, he read about the work of Robert Plutchik. Robert Plutchik is a psychologist, and he had work writing about all emotions were created by mixing in various intensities 8 basic or primary emotions in 4 pairs of opposites: ecstasy and grief, rage and terror, admiration and loathing, vigilance and amazement. So there you go. You got 8 knightly orders powered by 8 basic emotions. And as a bonus, rage meant that there was a barbarian berserker class after all. So we have wizard, cleric, thief, and fighter. But we got 2 classes left, and they're both bards. Fools are swashbucklers, rushing into danger and relying on their supernatural luck to survive. They hold the D6, and they're more of a player archetype with the soul of a bard. So Kieran says that every game has someone who doesn't care about being there. They're there for social reasons, to have fun and to mess around. They just want to take it lightly. From personal experience, having a player play as Asgrab Terboner in Curse of Strahd, I know exactly what he's talking about. So he designed this as a simpler class. They used the quote-unquote normal dice, the D6. Now, I said that everybody had their own specific die in die, and in the comic that's true. There's only one of each. In the role-playing game, though, the D6 runs the rest of the system, but it fits with the Fool, that they use the same type of die as everyone else. But Fools get to write on their D6 and change the numbers when people aren't looking. It's also designed with less symbolism in it to make it a bit more shallow, but it's deeper than you think just by looking at it. We're saving the best for last, in my opinion. The D4 represents the dictators, artistic diplomats who manipulate emotions with horrific magical words. These are the other half of the bard. The smallest die, the D4, is at the opposite end of the D20, which, if the D20 represents the physics and reality, the shaping of the world, the rules, the D4 embodies the soft parts, the role-playing. The D20 manipulates the rules, and the D4 manipulates the rest. The D4 is also connected to the D8 in shape, as it's just cut in half, and both classes are intrinsically tied to emotions. And the D4 represents a pyramid. It's a power structure. The dictator at top and everyone else below. It's the arts as sinister, emotionally manipulative magic. By performing their art, dictators can play emotions like a harp, plucking them or snapping them. They're bards if everyone was terrified of them. Now, spoilers for the comic. You do find out by the end of Volume 1, but still. There's one more class, the Fallen. These are also the primary antagonists. But if the Fair were elves as designed by William Gibson, then the Fallen are orcs auditioning for Tetsuo, the Iron Man. They are corrupted data. They speak in binary. The only way to become this class is to die. Any hero that dies in the world of Die rises again as a Fallen infinitely. You can never keep them down forever. But there's a way back. If as a Fallen you kill another hero, then you get to come back in their stead. Now, a major element of Die, both the comic and the RPG, is how it ends. All the players, all the personas, have to agree that they want to go home. It's their choice. And as I said before, the world of Die is based off of them. So yeah, it has all the bad parts, but it also has all the hopes and dreams. So potentially you're in a world where you get to be exactly what you want to be and do exactly what you want to do. It might seem obvious that a group of teenagers would want to get back to the real world, but potentially the world of Die, as horrible as it is in some way better than the real world for them. Or maybe all your personas are a group of elderly people in a nursing home reconnecting after years. It might be a little bit harder for them to go back to the world where they can't do as much as they used to. Instead, they're here, they're young, and they're heroes. I think that's the element that I'm most looking forward to see in practice at a table. So I'll definitely be following up once the RPG is fully released and having an episode on that specifically. I love these comics, and I'm really looking forward to this RPG. And I was really glad to be able to talk about some of the elements that made these games that I love so much what they are today. So thank you, Mr. Gillen. If you like this episode, share it with a friend. This was Eldritch History. I'm Jacob Tomlinson Korst. And until next time, may you always make your saving throw, especially against getting sucked into a terrible dimension made up of your own worst nightmares.